Yo, welcome to the Jaybefaunt channel. I am your host, James Fauntleroy. It is so good to see you all today. Oh my goodness, it is great to see all of you joining me on this beautiful day, whatever you're watching. If you're watching this on the premiere or you're watching this on the rewatch, welcome. Just to let you guys know, the Jaybefaunt channel is available on all major podcast platforms like Anchor, Apple, and Spotify podcasts, so you can subscribe to me there. I'm also part of the Revolutionary Blackout Network, so you can catch me on the JB Show on Sundays at 1 p.m. Eastern, as well as the Revolutionary Blackout Live, RBN Live, on Tuesdays at 4. And you can catch me on the Sabbath and JB Show on Thursdays at 6. Please make sure to give this video a thumbs up. And if you are new, please make sure to make that gorgeous appendage, smash down that subscribe button, and click the link bell to let you guys know whenever new content is uploaded. Also like to give a shout out to my patrons on Patreon and Coffee. Without you guys, the lights would not be on. So I appreciate and thank every one of you from the top and bottom of my heart. It means so much to me. Thank you. Now, as you all know, this is a reading that I am doing today of course, Dirty Truths by the great Michael Parenti. Don't want to get that glare out of there. So we're going to be doing a reading of that. And we're reading chapter 2, part 5, which is entitled Yeltsin's Coup and the Media's Alchemy. So this is going to be talking about Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin was a president of Russia back in the 90s. And I'm just going to say this. Yeltsin was a motherfucker. Now, let me tell you. Yeltsin was very interesting. In fact, Yeltsin was instrumental to the United States. And why do I say that? Well, here we go. This is from a Time magazine. And this is entitled Yanks to the Rescue. That's the nickname they gave Boris Yeltsin. And the subheading says the secret story of how American advisors helped Yeltsin win. So basically, the United States actually meddled in a Russian election. You got that? So the United States meddled in the Russian election to help Yeltsin win. And in doing so, this actually talks about Yeltsin's rise to power and how he was very totalitarian in his ways. Yeltsin was very undemocratic in his approach. So Parenti actually brings this out and remind you guys that this book was written 24 years ago in 1996. So I just want you guys to remember that. And this is actually going to be a very interesting part to this book. This has a lot of historical analysis. So strap in, kids. This is going to be a doozy. All right. So Yeltsin's coup and the media's alchemy. One seldom hears about capitalism in the capitalist-owned media. For decades, we were told that the Cold War was a contest between freedom and communism, without any references to the interest of global capitalism. But with the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, U.S. leaders began intimating. Can I read today? Intimating that there was something more on the agenda than just free elections or the former captive nations, namely free markets. Of what use was political democracy, they even seemed to be saying, if it allowed the retention of an economy that was socialistic or even social democratic? So they publicly acknowledged that the goal of U.S. policy was to restore capitalism in the former communist nations. The propaganda task was to treat capitalism as inseparable from democracy, while ignoring that the many undemocratic capitalist regimes from Guatemala to Indonesia to Zaire. However, capitalism still sounded, well, too capitalistic. So the preferred terms were free market and market economy concepts that appeared to include more of us than just the Fortune 500. So President Clinton announced before the United Nations on September 27, 1993, our overriding purpose is to expand and strengthen the world's community of market-based democracies. In a similar vein, the New York Times, October 5th, 1993, noted that President Boris Yeltsin remains the best hope for democracy and a market economy in Russia. End quote. Far from being wedded to each other, capitalism and democracy are often on a fatal collusion course, as demonstrated by the horrific events in Russia during the autumn of 1993. Multi-party electoral democracy is useful when it can be used to destabilize one-party socialism. But when it becomes a barrier to an untrammeled capitalism, democracy runs into trouble. The first ominous signs came in 1992 when the presidents of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Russia demanded that their parliaments be suspended and they be allowed to rule by ukase. On cue, the US media started making sympathetic noises about obstructionist legislators, letting us know that parliamentary democracy was getting in the way of democratic market reforms. Washington threw its support behind executive leaders like Boris Yeltsin, a champion of the free market. Orwell lives. Those of us who have repeatedly challenged the outrageous misrepresentations perpetuated by the gaggle of concubines who compose our free market and independent press still must marvel at the media's newspeak and doublethink treatment of Yeltsin's bloody coup in Russia in 1993. I had thought that George Orwell's model of propaganda as reality in reverse was crudely overdone. Propaganda is most effective when it relies on emphasis, tones, and overall framing rather than when it blatantly inverts reality. But the US media's treatment of Yeltsin's bloody coup is a real life replication of Orwell's model. Quote unquote, tyranny is freedom, the blatant reversal of reality, the unblinking propagation of the crassest lies. Here we have executive leader who tears up his country's constitution, disbands parliament, abolishes the constitutional court, launches an armed attack upon the parliamentary building, kills hundreds of resistors and demonstrators, jails opposition leaders without bail, arrests and detains tens of thousands, puts hundreds of elected and appointed officials under investigation, expels thousands of non-Russians from Moscow, bans labor unions and political activities, exercises monopoly control over all broadcast media, suppresses dozens of publications and television shows, and permanently outlaws 15 political parties, and who is hailed by US leaders as a savior of democracy. With self-confirming momentum, the news media did not merely excuse the repression as a necessary evil, but celebrated it as a step forward. This transformation of a violent putsch into heroic salvation of democracy was truly one of the marvels of modern propaganda. Here's how it was done. The Unconstitutional Constitution. It is a rare democracy in which conflicts do not arise between the executive and the legislator. What often happens is that a compromise is worked out. But compromise was just what Yeltsin and his Western allies were not interested in. Quote, I will not agree with I will not agree with any compromise with any bodies, categorically not, end quote. He is quoted saying in the New York Times in September 28, 1993. Yet from the beginnings, he was portrayed as the moderate and compromising proponent, while his adversaries were described in the Times in September 22nd, 1993 as, quote, communists and nationalists who have blocked his legislation at every turn, end quote. Once Yeltsin tore up the Constitution, that document was seen as seriously defective. Appearing on One, October 3rd, 1993, Zygmunt Brzezinski, father of Mika Brzezinski, also husband of Joe Scarborough on Morning Joe on MSNBC, yeah, her father, Zygmunt Brzezinski, falsely dismissed the Russian Constitution as the old Brezhnev one. The next day, NPR's All Things Considered interviewed a member of Yeltsin's party in parliament who called it the Stalin Constitution, another false assertion that went unchallenged by the NPR host. The New York Times, September 22nd, 1993, approvingly repeated Alexander Solzhenitsyn's untruthful charge that, quote, this was less parliament in Western terms than a gang of party hacks, more selected than elected in 1989 when the Soviet Union still existed and the Communist Party held sway, end quote. A front page headline in the Los Angeles Times of October 3rd, 1993 announced, quote, Bill of Wrongs, Constitution and Mess in Russia, end quote. The accompanying story stated, quote, the weakest link in the legal structure is the Constitution itself, enacted in its most recent incarnation in 1978 under Soviet power, end quote. Truth peeked through only once in the New York Times. In an op-ed piece in October 2nd, 1993, historian Robert Daniels pointed out that every member of parliament had been freely elected in 1990. The Russian parliament was not operating under Brezhnev or Stalin constitution, but under a fully democratic reforms of 1989. It was not to be confused with the earlier Soviet parliament, which did have some non-elective seats, but went out of existence 2 years before. When not faulting the Constitution, the Times berated the Russian people themselves. Quote, there was nothing in the upbringing of the people that would equip them to appreciate the notion that above the laws there could be principles, that the Constitution itself could be unconstitutional if it served only a small clique, end quote. That was September 26, 1993. Russia's democratic institutions were undermined because, quote, they were created before the fledgling businessmen learned to defend their interests through politics, end quote. That's October 10th, 1983. Russia is populated by a, quote, people steeped in socialist propaganda, end quote, who were outraged by the vulgar displays of the new rich, end quote, October 5th, 1993. Certainly not the right attitude for building capitalism. T. Unlawful lawmakers. Most of the Russian legislators were non-communists and erstwhile Yeltsin allies. Yet they were repeatedly labeled by the press as, quote, communists and ultranationalists, communist holdovers and unrepentant communists, armed fascist communist rebels, the old elites, and die-hard communists. In contrast, Yeltsin's former Communist Party affiliation was rarely mentioned. To be sure, some of the legislators were communists. that they were freely elected to office was of no matter. They still were considered anti-democratic simply by virtue of being communists. The lawmakers were depicted as opposed not only to reforms, but to democratic reforms and therefore to democracy itself. The Times, September 22nd, 1993, told us, quote, "This remains at its heart a battle between those who broke early with the totalitarian, centralized state and those who are trying to maintain its essence," end quote. In fact, the repressive centralization was being carried out by Yeltsin and his administration, not his opponents in parliament. The largest formation of the Russian parliament, the Civic Union, favored slowing down the pace of privatization and retaining public ownership of those plants and collectives that were showing a profit. In this, they were moving contrary to capitalistic state policy, which normally nationalizes industries at public expense and hands the profitable ones to private corporate interests, also at public expense. Far from being quote unquote hardliners, the Russian legislators were charting a mixed economy course between total collectivization and Yeltsin's hardline free market policy. The real sin was that they were neither dismantling the public sector swiftly enough nor putting the interests of capitalistic investors above all other considerations. Minimizing the slaughter. Yeltsin was given a generous rewrite when he abolished not only parliament but every other elected representative body in the country, including many city councils and regional councils or Soviets. The New York Times, October 10, 1993, dismissed the Soviets as quote unquote creatures of the early Bolshevik era, end quote. Left unmentioned was that the councils had been recently democratically elected and that the president had no authority to abolish or restructure them. The armed attack launched by President Yeltsin against the parliament earned a complete whitewash from the US press. In what sounded like a replay of the Waco assault on the Branch Davidians, CNN commentators on October 4th, 1993, tirelessly referred to the very heavy weaponry inside the White House Russian parliamentary building, including perhaps rocket-propelled grenades and anti-tank weaponry and even surface-to-air missiles. No evidence of such heavy weaponry ever materialized. The only footage we saw of those who occupied the White House showed only a makeshift collection of light arms. There were supposedly a very, quote, very heavy exchange of fire from both sides, end quote. The exchange was actually a one-sided slaughter caused by bombardment of the parliament building by Yeltsin forces using 125 millimeter and 75 millimeter artillery shells, fragmentation bombs, and heavy caliber machine gun fire. The U.S. press accepted the official count of 144 dead, but the president of Kalmyk Republic, who spent all of October 4th in the parliament building, reported seeing hundreds of bodies and estimated the final toll at 1,000. His observations were reported by Moscow correspondent Mike Davidow in the People's Weekly World, October 30th, 1983, and nowhere else in the U.S. press. Davidow noted that a number of Russian publications, including the pro-Yeltsin Komsomolskaya, something in my eye. Komsomolskaya Pravda. Sorry, I'm bad for these Russian names. October 15, 1983, reported that 1,000 deaths and mass cremations. The New York Times, November 11th, 1993, finally acknowledged that many Russians believe that 1,052 people were killed, but assured its readers that these reports were unconfirmed. The Violent Renegades versus Boris the Gentle. During CNN's October 4th day-long coverage of the assault, the anti-coup legislators were described as, quote, very hardline communists who have nothing to lose and renegade lawmakers, end quote. CNN reporter Eileen O'Connor turned instant psychiatrist, noting that many of the rebels were, quote unquote, social misfits and some were, quote unquote, definitely mentally ill. A New York Times report, October 5th, 1983, informed us that, quote, the parliamentary plot jumped right out of the communist textbook on revolution, end quote. That same issue admiringly described the attack on the parliament as a quote unquote textbook example of the decisive application of military power. The perpetuator of the coup, Boris Yeltsin, was portrayed as a leader who, quote, seems to rely on popularity, not brute force, end quote. That's from the Times in September 26, 1993, and who shows, quote unquote, commendable restraint. That's from the Times of October 5th, 1993. As the Parliament building was going up in flames and dead and wounded were being carried out, CNN's Bob Kane concluded with a straight face that we were witnessing a, quote, measured action by Yeltsin forces, not an all-out assault, end quote. Kane and other CNN commentators assured that Yeltsin, quote, really doesn't want to fire on his countrymen, end quote. They noted that relatively restrained response from the government and falsely claimed that Yeltsin made an attempt to reach negotiated settlement but was rebuffed. Bullshit. Final solution. The U.S. press failed to point out that market reforms have brought disaster to Russia. The lifting of price controls spurred an inflation that dissolved real wages and reduced the majority of the population to virtual penury. By 1993, Russia's health system was crumbling. The education system was deteriorating. Cholera, diphtheria, and tuberculosis were spreading, as was poverty, hunger, and homelessness. And crime, corruption, and prostitution were flourishing. Whatever economic democracy was the communists had managed to put together, including the guaranteed right to a job, medical care, and education, and subsidized food, housing, and utilities, was being scuttled. Russia became a juicy chunk of the third world, with immense reserves of cheap labor, a vast treasure of natural resources, and industrial assets to be sold off at giveaway prices. Yeltsin did what other desperate defenders of capitalism in crisis have done. He suppressed all opposition. This tyranny was given its fig leaf in the form of rigged constitution and a showcase of electoral system that poses no real challenge to executive state power. The Duma was reduced to a debating society, while Yeltsin went on to rule largely by executive decree. One thing is certain: U.S. leaders and the mouthpieces of the mainstream media will always be there cheering on the Yeltsins of the world. So, that's Yeltsin's coup and the media's alchemy. Basically, talking about how Yeltsin was totalitarian. And the media basically was like, yeah, no, Yeltsin was a good guy. So, yeah. And the next part that we're going to be reading is called Now for the Weather. So, we'll be talking about that next. But yeah, really, look, this is just the same old thing, right? The United States ends up going into a country, taking the most right-wing leader that is sympathetic to capitalism, and they put them in power, and then they destroy dissenting voices. They destroy the opposition. I mean, look what happened actually in Ukraine. Look, Zelensky basically did a lot of the same things that Yeltsin did. He basically got rid of dissenting voices and basically took on a very deeply undemocratic role. And the fact is that the propaganda, the brainwashing that took place is people equate capitalism with democracy. Capitalism is a economic model that can be applied to different states. Democracy is a governmental model that can be applied to certain states. The economic model and the governmental model are two different things. And really, capitalism is actually deeply anti-democratic in its implementation. Why do we say that? Go to work. Go to work and try to make everything democratic in your workplace. Try to say, oh, we should vote on all the decisions that are being done within the workplace. Guess what? They're going to laugh you right out of the building. Who makes the decisions? Well, it's if it's publicly owned, it's going to be a board, an executive board, right? That makes all the decisions for everybody else. If it's privately owned, then it's going to be, either one or two people that are going to make the decisions for the whole of the company. But it's never actually democratically ran, as the workers have a say. Workers will give suggestions, and maybe they might, listen to those suggestions or note those suggestions, but it's not ran in a democratic fashion. And so what is socialism? Socialism would be the workers owning the means of production. And if that being said, then that means that the means of production would be, ran in a democratic fashion by the workers who actually run the place. So when you look at capitalism versus socialism, actually socialism and by extension communism are actually actually democratic in their implementation into the workplace. The thing is that the brainwashing had to take place to separate the democratic nature of socialism and capitalism to make you think that it is not. So what they do is that they apply the anti-socialistic practices of capitalism and they say, oh, that's communism, that's socialism. They're anti-democratic, when in reality, it was basically the old switcheroo. They basically implemented an undemocratic economic model to you as well as to Russia, and then said, oh, hey, capitalism is democratic, when in reality, it never was. And it's just like what Michael Parenti was saying, is that they really just couldn't call it capitalism. They had to call it the free market or the market economy because they wanted to make it sound more inclusive, when really capitalism is not inclusive. Capitalism never was inclusive. Capitalism was never meant to be inclusive. That's the thing about it. It's never meant to be inclusive. It was never, and the thing is that look at the inception of this country. Who were the people that were making all the rules? It was the wealthy, white, male landowners. They were the capitalists of the time. The poor whites didn't have a say over what happened, over what the Constitution said in this country. Sure as hell as my ancestors, those of us who were from African descent and who were slaves, we didn't have a say. We weren't even regarded as human beings. So guess what? Capitalism secludes. Outside of capitalism, socialism, communism, you can also say anarchism, includes. The thing is that, remember how George Carlin said, it's a big club and you ain't in it? That's what capitalism does. It creates a small, tiny little club where only the richest of the rich can get in. And then they can control everybody else. And so, because they had an ally in Boris Yeltsin, and guess what? They were like, okay, let's take our biggest adversary who, if they do things where people are propped up even more, and people start to get wind of what's really going on, then guess what? We're going to see, oh, well, Russia, they're a massive country, they're a massive superpower, and they're actually implementing things that we could have here. Like, look, hold up. It said they had guaranteed right to a job, federal jobs guarantee. That's what a lot of people who are proponents of MMT talk about, a federal jobs guarantee. Guess what? That's what they had, right? They had a right to a job, right? Medical care. So they had universal health care. They had education, universal education. They had subsidized food. Food was a right, right? Housing. You had housing for all. You had utilities for all. Can you imagine if they kept those systems in place and didn't have Boris Yeltsin and kept a communist president, a democratically elected communist legislator, as well as an executive in power? Can you imagine how that would be? Can you imagine if we don't have a Vladimir Putin in power right now? Because Vladimir Putin is just like Boris Yeltsin. He's anti-communist, anti-socialist. Can you imagine that? And can you imagine that happening in the vast information age that we're living in, where we would have internet in order to learn, oh, snap, Russia got all this stuff, and they're not even a capitalist country. Or we would still be calling it, the Soviet Union. They have all this stuff. They have things that we just don't have. We're suffering here. There's no homelessness. There's no hunger. Everybody has an education, right? Yeah, did the Soviet Union do some things wrong? Yeah, I mean, they're not perfect, but they were way ahead of what we have as regards of how they're taking care of the people. And if, you're guaranteed a job, guaranteed housing, food, education. What? So can you imagine how those of us here in the West would think if we had that model to go? Because then that would also help debunk, well, socialism doesn't work anywhere. Communism never worked. And the funny thing is that, looking back at, Nick's appearance on the Hill when he was basically debating Robbie on Rising. And this was a great point that was brought up by Brianna Joy Gray. If socialism and communism are so bad, why not let them fail on their own? Right? Why does the United States constantly have to sabotage socialism and communism in order to show that socialism and communism doesn't work? Why do you constantly have to put economic sanctions on them? Why does the United States constantly have to send in their goons in order to make a country that's turning socialist into a capitalist state? Why do they have to keep doing that? If it's so bad, let's watch from afar. Let it destroy itself on its own. Right? If you're running a race against somebody, why are you putting barriers in front of your opponent so that they trip and fall? Capitalism cheats. It cheats. That's what it does. If you're poor, if you're housing insecure, if you're worried about medical debt, if you're worried about student loan debt, if you're worried about a lot of the social ills that we have to endure, especially those of us who are Black people, it's because you're being cheated. That's the nature of capitalism. That's the nature of what it does. What makes you think it doesn't do that to communism and socialism? Anybody who tries to do any economic model outside of capitalism, capitalism is like, oh shit, look, we have to stop them because they know if it succeeds, then those of us who are the lower classes or the oppressed classes will look on and go, wait a minute. Capitalism has been playing us the whole time. Let's go with these guys. Look, I'm just saying they did it to, a lot of the socialists, who in communists and Marxists who were trying to lead revolutions back in the day. I mean, look what they did to George Jackson. They put him in prison. They put they killed his brother. Look at what they did to, Fred Hampton, Huey P. Newton. Look at, all the people that were put in prison or assassinated. Look at what they did. Look at what happened during the McCarthy era, where anybody else even suspected of being communist or socialist, they were basically thrown in jail. Capitalism had political prisoners like a mug because it did not want to take power away from the people at the top. That's the problem with capitalism. And you see it happen in Russia. So, a lot of the BS that's happening in Russia, you want to blame somebody? Blame the United States. I'm not saying that Russia didn't have its own issues, right? Every nation has its issues and missteps. But when it comes to a lot of the things that they had in place, they had it better. And some people will be like, well, they didn't have it better because, you had, the people who are in power that they make it sound like it was totalitarian when communists and socialists believe in democracy more than capitalists do. Capitalists don't believe in democracy. If they did, then they would democratize their companies if they truly believed in democracy. Show me a capitalist that says they believe in democracy, and I'll show you their companies and how totalitarian they're actually ran. When somebody truly believes something if they try to implement those same beliefs closely within their lives. And if they don't actually believe in it. They're just blowing smoke up your ass. So these oligarchs, they don't actually believe in democracy. They don't actually think Elon Musk believes in free speech and democracy. Bill Gates believes in democracy. Y'all gotta be kidding me right now. Donald Trump believes in democracy. Yeah. What? The Koch brothers. Democracy. Yeah, they don't believe in it. Nah. No. The Walton family, they don't believe in democracy. The Sackler family, they don't believe in democracy. George Soros believes in democracy? Hell no. They don't believe in democracy. No billionaire does. None of them do. If they did, they wouldn't be billionaires. and their companies will be worker owned. You think Jeff Bezos believes in democracy? Jeff Bezos even got blood on his hands. Doesn't believe in no damn democracy. You show me a billionaire that believes in democracy, I will show them as a liar. They're lying to you. I don't care if you consider yourself a conservative. If you truly care about democracy, you should care about democracy in your workplace. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. Anywho, thank you everybody for watching. The latest episode of my reading of Blood in My Eye by the great George Jackson is up on my Rockfin, so you guys can tune into that as well. Thank you to everybody who is contributing on Patreon, as well as on Coffee. I thank you so much. To the people who are also donating to the fund for me for housing on RBN, I deeply appreciate that too. That is going to be a major help for me because it's getting rough out here, and we have a hurricane coming by the middle of next week, Hurricane Ian. So that's going to be a doozy. Man, I hope it's not. I hope it doesn't go above a Cat 3. Hell, I hope it doesn't go above a Cat 2. I start to pay attention when it goes to Category 3 and up. That's when I'm like, we need to prep. If it's a Cat 1, it's like Hurricane Party. Cat 2, I'm chilling. Cat 3, I'm like, Cat 4, I'm like, oh no, damn. Cat 5, I'm like, okay, girds your loins, hunker down, we in trouble. Or like Whoopi said, you in danger, girl. So I'll be prepping for that. I'm gonna try to see if I can get a couple of these also more out the readings before the storm, just in case. Because power outages and stuff like that do happen, and we'll see. But I just want to thank everybody for watching. Yeah, and water your plants, water yourselves, lead the world better than you found it. Smoke them if you got them, drink them if you got them. If you ain't got them, then laugh, enjoy yourself, because joy is revolutionary as always. And mwah, 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 forehead kisses to each and every one of you. Yes. Y'all weren't expecting that note. I wasn't expecting that note, but I love